I pray that there will be no more war, because there's more pain in war than you can ever imagine. So we just have to hope and pray that there's no more wars, no more VCs, no more nothings.
On the 1st of September 1939, the course of Australian history changed forever. Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France threatened war unless German troops were withdrawn. 2 days later, for the second time in 25 years, Australia was at war.
This is the Cabinet War Room, the nerve centre of the Allied offensive during World War II. This room is some 3 metres below the busy streets of London, and in 1940-41 these streets were blitzed by German bombing, resulting in fear, fire, confusion, courage and a great determination to defeat the enemy. In this room and in this chair sat the famous Winston Churchill. From this room he said, "I will direct the war effort." Around him sat his chiefs of staff and members of the Defence Committee. Decisions made here affected Australians at home and Australians at war.
The key strategies of the war were determined here. The defence of Singapore that saw thousands of British Commonwealth soldiers marching into captivity. Campaigns in the Mediterranean and North Africa, where Australian sons fought side by side with British troops in key victories at Tobruk and El Alamein. One strategy which Australia's Prime Minister John Curtin resisted. He brought our boys home to confront the Japanese invasion rather than commit them to the war in Burma. Another important strategy determined here was the decision to bomb Germany's industrial centres, which sent young Australians like John Worley on courageous bombing missions. This strategy helped win victory in Europe, but at great human cost. In 1939, Britain needed the support of its Empire countries to win the war. But Australia's army was poorly equipped, and our Navy and Air Force were small. However, thousands of men were keen to do their bit for king and country. Australia sent 26,000 young men overseas to train for the Royal Air Force. One of them was John Worley from Willumbar, New South Wales. Aged 18, he farewelled family and friends and left Australia's shores, proud that he was a member of what was regarded as the glamour force in the services.
John Worley was typical of the young men who flew with Bomber Command, most of them in their early 20s. Theirs was a war of extreme contrasts. 1 minute, high in the night skies over a blazing city, searchlights crisscrossing the sky and shells exploding around them. The next minute, downing a beer in some little English pub not far from their airfield.
In an effort to win the war, Britain struck at the heart of industrial Germany. These night raids over France and Germany were vital to the Allied war effort. Each mission was a frightening, dangerous experience, and the odds of coming back were short.
On the 27th of January 1944, Lancaster bomber JB-637 was part of a massive bombing attack on Berlin. Some 1,500 tons of bombs were dropped that day. The city was a sea of flame. Operational records report that 33 aircraft failed to return that day, and one of those was John Worley's. Here at the Berlin War Cemetery, I expected to find John's headstone, but I was a little shocked to see around me headstones of 6 of his crewmen, 2 of them in their early 30s, and 5 of them only boys, aged between 20 and 23, lying here side by side in a city that they tried to destroy. Here at the Berlin War Cemetery, there are 2,600 Allied airmen, and 213 of these are Australians.
Australia's main contribution to the war in Europe was made by men like John Worley and his crewmates. More than 5,000 died in the skies over Europe, and they rest in peaceful cemeteries on foreign soil. But some of these men have no known grave, and this memorial is for them.
Runnymede is the official British Air Force memorial, and here you will find the names of some 20,000 British Commonwealth airmen who have no known grave. Canadians, New Zealanders, Englishmen, and some 1,400 Australians, friends in arms against the Germans, allies who flew thousands of missions together. For many Australian families after the war, there was no gravesite that they could visit to say their last goodbye to sons. And so, over the years, more recent generations have come to this place to lay flowers beneath the long lists of names, and sometimes to leave a personal message. This message says, George Turner, on the 50th anniversary of your non-return to us, we love you very much, Dad, and always will. You are always remembered in our thoughts. And that's from George's wife, his son and daughter, and their grandchildren.
Australians played an important part in the European war between 1939 and May 1945, but a larger role in campaigns in North Africa, the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The 9th Division of the AIF was formed in the Middle East early in 1941. They defeated Italian troops at Benghazi and Vichy French troops in Syria. However, their biggest test came in April 1941 against the crack German troops who were trying to take the port of Tobruk, a strategically important area. If the Allies could hold Tobruk, they would deny Germany a vital port for resupplying their forces and tie up troops and equipment that were needed in Europe. And so the Allies dug in and held off repeated attacks, often involving hand-to-hand fighting. Hundreds of German prisoners were taken. The enemy contemptuously referred to the defenders as rats, hiding in their holes, and insult the Aussies adopted with pride, calling themselves the Rats of Tobruk. Australians went on to help defeat the Germans at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. Our ships were active against the Italian Navy after Italy joined the war in 1940. In July, HMAS Sydney sank the much superior Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni. Australia rejoiced in this victory, although a year later the Sydney was sunk off the West Australian coast, tragically with no survivors. The Navy also supported Aussie troops at Tobruk by running supplies under cover of darkness with constant battering from the German Luftwaffe. And in April 1941, our ships helped transport the 6th Division to Greece. This was a disastrous campaign. The Allied troops were undermanned and under-equipped against the powerful German invaders, and the German Luftwaffe was unchallenged in the skies. German paratroops inflicted heavy casualties, and the Allies were forced to retreat to the island of Crete. But Crete was a repeat of Greece. Thousands more Australians were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. For many Australians who fought in the Second World War, time spent in prisoner of war camps was their major wartime experience. Some 8,500 were imprisoned by the Germans and 22,000 by the Japanese.
This place is Colditz, a medieval castle converted by the Germans into a POW camp during the war. Several hundred Australians were imprisoned here. One of these was Jack Champ. Jack joined the 6th Division AIF in 1939. He was 26 at the time. He fought in Greece and in the Western Desert and was one of 10,000 Allied soldiers captured in Crete.
Say, how did I feel when I was captured? it's a feeling of complete devastation, actually. You don't realise that this is ever going to happen to you. You don't conceive it. You think, well, you know, I might get killed, I might get wounded, but captured, you never thought of it. So all of a sudden you realise that you're gone, that the war is finished, and for years, or very nearly anyway, and there you are, a prisoner of war.
At Colditz, Jack spent much of his time planning escapes, studying, playing sport, looking forward to letters and Red Cross parcels from home, and thinking about what he would do after the war was over.
We, as prisoners of war in Germany, had, by comparison to the poor blacks in the hands of the Japs, a holiday. Admittedly, it was boring, and we were hungry most of the time, and we were deprived of our freedom. But the Germans, I always say, they didn't treat us badly, they didn't treat us well, they didn't treat us at all. But the poor blacks who were unfortunate enough to be captured by the Japanese, they had a most horrifying experience.
Although the Allies suffered a major defeat on Crete, many men from the 6th Division were successfully evacuated by the British and Australian Navy.
3,500 men of the famous 6th Division, which covered itself with glory throughout the Middle East campaigns, stride out through Melbourne streets, while 300,000 citizens roar a welcome.
In 1942, the 6th and 7th Divisions headed home to fight a new war and a new aggressor who threatened to invade Australia.
The Australian people have had too few opportunities to display their pride in the boys back from the Middle East. Melbourne welcomed this chance with its full vocal power and really made the welkin ring. Mothers, wives, sisters, brothers, all joined to pay tribute to these diggers who have proved themselves beyond all question worthy sons of their Anzac fathers.
On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese dramatically entered the war. They invaded the Malayan Peninsula and at the same time attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States was the only country with sufficient naval power in the Pacific to resist Japan. If Japan could destroy the American fleet, it could invade the Asian and Pacific areas, gain control of raw materials which were vital to their industrial expansion, and make peace before the Americans could rebuild their fleet. But at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese missed a vital target, the American aircraft carriers. During December 1941 and January 1942, the Japanese fought their way down the Malayan Peninsula. On the 15th of February 1942, after some fierce resistance by the Allies, the mighty British fortress of Singapore surrendered. Suddenly, 15,000 Australian soldiers became prisoners of the Japanese. For them and their loved ones on the home front, this was the beginning of 3.5 years of death, horror and uncertainty. These events were a terrible blow to the Australian government. Prime Minister John Curtin recalled Australian troops from the war in North Africa and the Middle East, and he looked to a new ally for support in the Pacific, the United States of America. In a desperate attempt to halt the Japanese, Australia sent 3 battalions, each approximately 1,000 strong, to protect Rabaul, Timor and Ambon. Ambon is 1,000 kilometres northwest of Darwin. It's difficult to imagine that this island was strategically important during the war, but with its deep sea harbour and operational airstrip, to the Japanese it was one step closer to Papua New Guinea and eventually to Australia. On the 17th of December 1941, Lieutenant Rod Gabriel and Privates Jimmy McDougall and Peter Gurry stepped ashore from a Dutch transport vessel. They were members of the 2nd 21st Battalion, codenamed Gull Force, and their job was to reinforce the troops of the Netherlands Indies against an expected Japanese invasion. The Japanese quickly overran the defensive positions manned by the Dutch, who surrendered after a day's fighting. Gull Force fought gamely on, on the north side defending Laha airstrip, and on the south side defending the town. They inflicted heavy losses, but after 4 days' fierce fighting, they were surrounded and forced to surrender.
Well, having been taken prisoner on the 3rd of February 42, we were, on the day after, on the 4th of February, we on the town side were marched into the barracks at Tantui, which we had previously occupied. And those barracks then became the POW camp. As far as the Laha side goes, as Laha was some miles across the bay, while we could see the general area, we had not the slightest idea what was going on there. What happened at Laha was the Japanese force, which came in the north of the island, came over the island there into and eventually took over the Laha aerodrome force, and there were some 47 killed in the action. There were some 11 escaped. There were 229 taken POW, so that the 229 of Gold Force plus the 10 RWF plus some Dutch servicemen were totally executed. There is not a survivor. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason for this massacre.
The Ambon War Cemetery is built on the site of the Tantui prisoner of war camp. And some of those Australians who perished in the camp are buried here. So too are those men who fought in a brave but futile attempt to defend the town and the Laha airstrip. On this terrace, there are 460 memorial plaques. And these plaques are a reminder of the men who died and who have no known grave. These men died on Ambon and in the Malacca and Celebes Islands. There is also a war memorial, and on the memorial are listed 460 names. And one of those names is Peter Gurry. Eden Hope is a long way from Ambon. It's a little town nestled peacefully on the banks of Lake Wallace, not far from the Victorian South Australian border. About 2 years ago, I attended a funeral here for an old digger. His mates formed a guard of honour around his graveside. The local president spoke of his wartime involvement, and the bugler played the last post. After the funeral service, we went back to the RSL hall, and it was here that I first met Jimmy McDougall. He walked up to me and he said, "Are you a Gurry?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you any relation to Peter Gurry, who served with me at Ambon during World War II?" I didn't know much about Uncle Peter. In fact, I'd never met him. Growing up, I was told that he served somewhere in the Pacific Islands, but wandered off from camp one night and was never seen again, missing, presumed dead. And this was the first time that I'd actually met someone who'd served with him. I learned a lot about Uncle Peter from his mate Jimmy. Peter was in B Company, defending the airstrip, and Jimmy was across the bay defending the town. That was the last Jimmy saw of Peter. Peter J. Gurry's service and casualty form lists him as missing, and for official purposes presumed dead, dated the 20th of February 1942. But this cold, formal prose does not reveal the horror of what actually happened on that day. Based on the evidence of Lieutenant Nakagawa at the Japanese War Crimes Tribunal held at Ambon after the war was over, it seems certain that Peter Gurry was one of 200 men who were slaughtered and buried in a mass grave. From all accounts, the men went bravely to their deaths. One by one, they were led to the execution site, where they were either bayoneted to death or beheaded. Their hands were tied behind their back, and some knelt blindfolded on the ground. The tomb of the unknown soldier at the Australian War Memorial contains the bones of a soldier of the First World War who has no known grave. But it also honours men like Peter Gurry and his mates on Ambon Island, who were executed by the Japanese and have no identifiable remains. Although their fate was cruel, perhaps it was kinder than the fate suffered by men like Rod Gabriel and Jimmy McDougall in the prison camps of Tantui and Hainan Island. Of the 809 members of Gulf Force who were captured in February 1942, only 119 survived the war. Jimmy McDougall was one of 267 members of Gulf Force who was taken to Hainan Island off the south coast of China in late 1942. These men were sick and were supposedly sent for recuperation. In reality, they suffered conditions even worse than at Tan Tui. Jimmy reckons music was one of the things that stopped him from throwing in the towel. He made a ukulele in the camp and tried as best he could to lift the spirits of his mates.
I believe the greatest asset that in life, and certainly it was in a POW camp, would be sense of humour. The fellows had to, put up with gross lack of food, complete lack of medical supplies, gross overwork, and various diseases such as malaria and dengue fevers, dysenteries, amoebic and bacillary, gastroenteritis of a chronic nature, and lack of food, of course, or the small amount of food brought about vitamin deficiencies. The main one, of course, would be beriberi and pellagra and those things that went with it. I can recall once after a work party one night calling into our regimental aid post, which is like your first aid area, and a fellow with one of the many fellows with down the front of his shin about a 4-inch ulcer, and to get some treatment, a Dutch MO with tears down his face would say, take your dressing, which was actually a piece of his shirt, khaki shirt, take it down to the tap lad, rinse it out and put it on again. I have nothing.
There were no Red Cross parcels and letters from home for prisoners of the Japanese, just the constant struggle for survival, with the hope of liberation, enough to keep a few of them alive. After the fall of Ambon in February 1942, the Japanese bombed Darwin. Part of their air attack was launched from the Laha airfield. They then landed at Buna on the east coast of Papua New Guinea and pushed overland towards Port Moresby. They met Australia's 39th Battalion on the Kokoda track. Our boys delayed their advance, but the Japanese reached Imata Ridge and could see the lights of their objective. But their efforts were in vain. Exhausted and without supplies, they were ordered to retreat, and the Australians hounded them back along the track. Even with victory in sight, jungle warfare was an horrific experience. Men had to cope with the heat, tropical rain, meagre provisions and malaria. The ground was steep and muddy, and an ambush could be moments away behind the dense foliage or kernai grass. Fighting was fierce, and the wounded were taken out by stretcher bearers, Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, as they were affectionately nicknamed by the Aussies. But above all else, the diggers feared one thing.
Until they went into action, the big fear of the thing was when you got orders to go in was whether you'd let your mates down, or could you do it, or what would you do, or how would you do it. It was always that, will I let my mates down, or how would I do it? Well, every soldier had this fear, and it's a fear that no man or woman or child could tell you about until you went through it yourself.
Ted Kenner needn't have worried about letting his mates down. He was a country boy from Western Victoria. His army mates nicknamed him Ned. He was a bit of a rebel, not keen on marching or taking orders, but happy on manoeuvres in the bush. On the 15th of May 1945, in the southwest Pacific at Wewak, Ted's platoon was ordered forward to take an enemy observation position. He remembers the day well.
Perfect day, actually. Lovely day. And there was a bit of shooting, a bit of noise around the joint, and our orders were to attack this hill. As we attacked, we come under position. We all went to ground, and actually you couldn't see our target because of the nature of the ground. It was all right. It was quite comfortable down there, but you couldn't see anything. So I stood up and had a go at the Bren, and it was a hip job, and you couldn't fire that accurately with it. It was spraying around, but wasn't doing much good. So I discarded that and called for one of my mates that's still down in the Mustang, called for a rifle, and fired a few shots out of the rifle, and they were quite accurate, and we done a good job, and that allowed the tanks to get their pointers in and give us cover and fire. So we, after the 2 bunkers that I took, they were able to do this, and we took the position. That was it. But it was just a job.
Ted's a reluctant hero. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery in combat. As the Australians and our American allies gained control of the skies, resupply became easier and the chances of success increased. By early 1943, the Allies in the Pacific were well on top. The Japanese suffered heavy naval losses at the Battle of Midway, and their soldiers were pushed back across the Owen Stanley Mountains and defeated at Boona and Gona. The actions of men like Kenner on the battlefront were an inspiration to those home in Australia. Most Australians on the home front responded to Prime Minister Curtin's call for an all-in effort to win the war on the production front as well as the battlefront. As fit men were conscripted into the army, other men and women were directed into industries which were essential to the war effort. Sport was cut back. Petrol, clothing and some food items were rationed. As more men were sent overseas to fight, women were urged to join the Air Force, Army and Navy to release more men for combat roles. Engineers and labourers were conscripted into the Civil Constructional Corps as roads were bulldozed in the outback to make a supply line to the northern front at Darwin. Even the kids got into the act.
He's off to the sewing circle, and that's where Mum comes in, with a stitch in time to save 9 lives.
Women were taken into jobs previously reserved for males. They worked on the trams and in the factories, although most didn't get an equal day's pay for an equal day's work. About 100,000 men left their farms for the fighting, and some women joined the Women's Land Army to help get agricultural products from the farm to the factories and eventually to the front line. But much of the work on farms was done by wives, mothers or daughters.
I left, of course, school in 1943. In 1944 I turned 18. And off I went to Hamilton on the very day and tried to join the RANS. The recruiting officer pointed out to me, but not only was I ineligible to join the RANS because I had to stay put, and he did tell me, which cheered me up a little, that I was going to do my bit by contributing with my help to my father. It was very lonely after being at boarding school for all those 7 years I was at school in Geelong, and I found it very restrictive because there was no petrol to go anywhere, and very hard work too, and I wasn't really very much that way inclined.
The women who worked in the munitions factories played a vital role in the war effort. The hours were long, the work monotonous and at times dangerous, but there was a closeness and mutual support that came out of this adversity.
They were hard days, but look, the morale was high, that was for sure. I mean, everybody was supporting everybody. And I really think that we had more friends in those days. Everybody tried to support someone else. Now, for instance, when we were working in the ammunition, there were a lot of girls who had boyfriends and husbands, you know, away. And if a girl might say, oh, I haven't had a letter from Joe, you know, for a fortnight. Well, every day when she'd come to work, you know, everybody'd be around, did you get the letter last night? You know, everybody was just so anxious to know. And one of the things that always sticks in my mind, that the first thing that of each day, you wanted to grab a paper. You know, you'd grab a newspaper and there'd be a long list in the paper of who was killed, missing or injured or something, you know, some of the people. Everybody wanted to see that list first thing to see if there was a name on it that they knew, you know. It was hooray when there was nobody there that you knew, you know. We used to be even given time off from work at the AMOs to go in and see the boys marching, you know. And all those beautiful young fellas, you know, marching off as proud as punch, and then half of them to not come home, you know. It was really very sad. Very, very emotional.
But there were tensions in wartime Australia as well. Black market operators sold rationed goods at inflated prices. The wharfies and coal miners went on strike, and this divided the nation. The blackouts and air raid practices grated on people's nerves, and the American presence was often resented by our boys, who complained that the Yanks were overpaid, oversexed and over here. But most accepted the shortages and discomforts and continued to support the troops in whatever way they could to secure an Allied victory. The Allied armies invaded Europe at Normandy on D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944, and advanced towards Berlin, liberating cities and villages in Western Europe. Thousands of people lined the streets, cheering the soldiers who would free them from tyranny. Perhaps now they could get their lives back together again. But some places were silent and deserted.
If you ever wondered why Australians like John Worley fought in the Second World War some 20,000 kilometres from home in Europe, come to this place, Oradour-sur-Glane in the south of France. Here, on a Saturday afternoon in June 1944, a crack SS Panzer Division occupied the town. The Germans lined the local villages up against the wall and shot the men to death. The women and children were herded in the church and slaughtered. The church was then set alight, and the rest of the village put to the torch. When you visit the graveyards here, you will see children, parents and grandparents occupying the same plot. A grim reminder that 3 generations of French people were wiped out in one afternoon.
Almost a year later, on the 8th of May, 1945, VE Day, Germany surrendered. As the Russian allies pushed into Germany and Poland from the east, they discovered places more horrific than Oradour-sur-Glane.
Between 1939 and 1945, some 6 million innocent, unarmed Jewish people, men, women, children and babies, were exterminated by the Nazis in Europe as part of a deliberate policy to try and eliminate all traces of Jewish history, heritage, customs and traditions. 2 million of these people were murdered in their own towns and villages, either confined in ghettos and starved to death, or taken to mass murder sites. The other 4 million were brought on trains to distant concentration camps like this one at Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland.
On the train we didn't know where we are going. And then when they opened, it was a good train and it was packed. It was people, we couldn't even sit down, we had to stand up with so many in one wagon. And I don't know how long it takes. It wasn't such a big distance between
big distances.
But it takes such a long time, train stop and stop. And when they opened the door, we noticed that this Birkenau, we've seen these chimneys and the smoke and the smell. We couldn't still believe it. It still was something in us that we said, no, it's impossible, that's not, but it was Birkenau. And we stayed there for 3 weeks. We were pushed to the barracks, and we were supposed to go to gas because, you see, I haven't got a number. People who are supposed to live have always number, tattoo. They didn't give us number. But they didn't know what to do with the 300 women. We were pushed down and up, and then at night they wake up, we counted again and counted again. Hunger and thirst and lice. That was terrible. We were scratching and hungry and thirsty, and I don't know, I had was probably, if I come with this fever already, I got it up that typhoid, I was very, very weak, and I drink water from the gutter. I was so thirsty, we didn't have enough water and we didn't have enough food. If somebody wanted to pick the leaf of cabbage what was on, they would shoot straight away. And one day come a German standing on the stool, and he called names, Helen Rosner and Mansi Rosner and Nusha Horowitz, all this who were on the 300 people, and they put us to the wagon, and we were traveling to arrive to Venice. That was really a miracle. Yes, and well, I'm shaking. No, I'm not shaking. No.
Leo and Helen Rosner were amongst the few Jewish people who managed to escape the Holocaust. They were saved by the German manufacturer Oskar Schindler. After the war was over, they returned to Krakow to find Leo's family, but only he and two of his brothers had survived. Leo and Helen came to Australia in 1949.
I don't hold grudge against Germans, because there are good and bad people in every nationality, regardless of religion, of race, or nationality. See, I am alive thanks to a German. And same, there are some bad Poles, some bad Jews, and bad Germans. They are good also. And I am not so sensitive, as my wife, Helen. She's a sensitive woman.
I'm not sensitive anymore. I harden up. It's all right.
Good on you.
Leo's mother, father, 6 brothers and sisters were all murdered by the Nazis. Today, he and Helen live in Melbourne with their children and grandchildren. Music remains one of the most important things in Leo's life and has helped him cope with the tragedy of the Holocaust. But what of the Australian soldiers who survived the war in Europe, North Africa and the Pacific? And in particular, the prisoners of war. How did they cope after the war was over? What was it like for them when they returned home?
My husband had come back from New Guinea in a very bad state. He'd been very badly burnt on the Kokoda Trail. He wasn't well, very depressed, and we lost our first baby. We were about 12 hours old, which depressed him even further. And I don't even know whether he did know I was pregnant again, because I'd had a miscarriage, and he committed suicide.
My husband's brother was taken prisoner in Singapore. I think he was only there about 3 or 4 days when Singapore fell. And he was on that Burma Railway, and he was in Changi. And now when he left here, I would say he was about 13 or 14 stone. When he came home, he was about 7. You know, he was just one bag of bones, and it was just horrible. And those prisoners of war weren't worth 2 bob when they come home. He never was. He wasn't worth just 2 bob.
It was a strange sort of a feeling to have. We just seemed to be apart from other Australians. It took a long, long time to overcome that, really. It did. Some of them I don't think ever overcome, but some just got away and worked on the food box, a couple of blokes, and all, they just didn't get around at all, just stopped there. And there was nothing wrong with them mentally. Some were affected, certainly. I suppose I am too. When I'd eat a fruit cake, I wouldn't be sitting there talking.
I think Jimmy being in the POW camp was a bit detrimental to his things. He seemed to be more happy with his mates than with us, for a start. I think he felt that he didn't fit in with family for a while, and then of course as we got more bigger family, he fitted better than what he had done when he first come home. I wouldn't say that he wasn't glad to be home. He was jolly glad to be home, but he had a bit of a battle too, health-wise, and that. So, but he's been a battler all the time, really.
Not only defence servicemen who suffered during the war, there were Indigenous people like labourers or straight-out civilian people, and and civilians taken, such as on the Burma Railway there for building that. God knows, it's something in 6 figures who died. Civilians taken to Japan for working in factories, coal mines or something. And last but certainly not least, comfort women, of which there's some estimate of 200,000 women from some 6 or 8 different countries, taken for nothing more or less than prostitution.
Monuments to the horrendous nature of war are around us everywhere. In Berlin, there's a church that was gutted during the Allied bombing raids that killed 600,000 civilians. In England, there's a cemetery to the Allied airmen who have no known grave. In the south of France, there's a little village that still stands as a monument to the men, women and children who were slaughtered one afternoon in 1944. And in Poland, there's Auschwitz-Birkenau. Ambon's a good place to remember the sacrifice of all Australians during the Second World War. To remember the men who died in a massacre here in 1942. To remember the 402 Australians who died in captivity on Ambon during the final year of the war. And all those who lost their lives in those terrible years between 1939 and 1945. Nor should we forget the men and women on the home front. They worked hard for final victory. And the veterans? Well, there are many men and women whose lives were diminished or totally ruined by the dreadful tragedy of the Second World War. On Ambon, I remember Uncle Peter, aged 31, a member of Gulf Force. Standing here, I can understand why some people find it difficult to forgive the Japanese for what they did at places like Ambon. It's easier for my generation. Today we have close ties with friends and neighbours in Asia and the Pacific. But at times, it's still very difficult to reconcile the past with the future. The one thing I do know, as the Second World War passes into memory, we must never forget the men and women who struggled and died for the freedom that we enjoy today.